But let me just officially welcome you to this session of MagLab Virtual Open House, our scientist speed session with Dr. Jeremy Owens, a paleo-oceanographer. So we're going to learn a little bit about him and his work today. Remember, this is an Ask Me Anything style session, so you can ask all sorts of questions, put them in the chat, and we will get them answered. And again, don't miss other open house events, and stick around at the end of this Zoom webinar to take a short survey about this session, okay? So after the webinar ends, there'll be a short survey. So I guess with that introduction, I can toss it over to our featured speaker, Dr. Owens. Take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Kristen. Excited to share my work and just give a brief introduction, and then we can go into any questions. So I just want to share sort of what we do as paleo-oceanographers at the MagLab. And I'll briefly also talk about sort of why we're at the MagLab. But my research really focuses on understanding ancient climate change and specifically deoxygenation. So many people have heard about climate change, and you hear about all sorts of different aspects, but one that maybe is not as prevalent, but becoming more and more important is how oxygen in the oceans have changed throughout Earth's history and currently as well. So I'm going to show a few figures on that, but what we're interested in is how ancient climate change has happened and what we might be able to learn from ancient climate change and then understand maybe what our future may or may not look like. There we go. All right, so how we do this, it's quite a broad field, and so we really integrate a number of different aspects, and so it's really an integrated science. It's not just one of the pillars of our understanding of science, but we bring together chemistry. We look at the chemistry of the rocks to then understand the biology, how that affects living organisms, and it takes physics as well. So how this the sediments are deposited is a physical process through ocean currents and even deposition into becoming a rock. And so it's really using all three of these. And so that's what kind of makes it fun. It's challenging. We use certain aspects of each of these. And this is why it's important to understand and study all three branches of science. And I think the fun part is actually integrating them together to understand another field or work that we do. So for those that don't understand or know about marine oxygenation, there's a big change in ocean oxygenation in the last several decades, and the red areas are places that have lost oxygen in the surface ocean. And there's a few places with blue that have actually increased, but largely our oceans are losing oxygen, both due to nutrient inputs, but also because of a warming Earth, you actually have lower gas solubility. And so oxygen decreases as the planet typically warms. And so we actually have evidence of this, and we see this in the geologic record as well, which is what we do. So how this happens, this is sort of a basic equation that most people probably understand. So photosynthesis is moving from right to left, where it takes water and CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it converts that with the energy of the sun to make organic matter, CH2O, and oxygen. And so this is a way to produce oxygen. However, if there's the same amount of respiration, it moves this equation to the right, and that's what you and I do, right? As we take organic matter, we use oxygen, we get energy out of that, and when we breathe out, we release CO2 and water. And so if photosynthesis and respiration are at equilibrium, the same amount is happening, there's no change in the amount of CO2 or oxygen. But we know throughout Earth's history, we've buried lots of organic matter. That's what fossil fuels are. And so because of this buried organic matter, it means we've had increased photosynthesis. We've actually increased oxygen on our atmosphere and consumed CO2 because it's now in organic matter. And so throughout Earth's history, we actually haven't had as much oxygen in the atmosphere as we have today over the 4.6 billion years. And this is because of a slight imbalance in the system where we have photosynthesis bearing organic matter. But essentially what we're doing today with burning of fossil fuels that most of us understand is we're taking organic matter and it's burning in our engines with oxygen, and it releases CO2 and water. And most people think about only the CO2 side, because that's what we talk about, the carbon dioxide, increasing our atmosphere. But we're actually also decreasing oxygen. it's really small. It's not like we're going to die from this, but we can see this in a basic equation in the modern record. So this is what we're interested in the geologic record. And so what we can see here is some of the effects on this. So you can see organisms that have died, coral reef that have been bleached because of low oxygen, and a few other things. I'm going to walk through a few more slides here. But how do we do this in the ancient record? And this is really challenging because we're left with fingerprinting climate. And many people say, well, how do you do this? It's much like other techniques we use, right? Things like fingerprints, DNA evidence, or tire prints. Or if you're really lucky, you might have direct recordings. And so these are ways to fingerprint them. Well, we have the same sort of methods to look at the ancient record. And so if we can put people that have committed crimes in prison based on using these sort of fingerprints or proxies, we can do the same thing in the geologic record. And so some ways we do this really awesome is you can look at instrumental records, but instrumental records don't go back very far, maybe a few hundred years. Historical records where people have written things down go back a little farther, but only to written time, so it's not that far. There's also some accuracy issues. But if you go a little farther back, we start using tree rings, and tree rings are awesome. We can date based on the number of rings, and we can get annual records, which are really awesome, but they don't go, living trees don't go as far back as Earth's history. Ice cores, very similar. You can do very high resolution, and we have great ice core records that go a little bit farther back, maybe now a few million years. Coral reefs, similar idea. And lastly, ocean sediments, which is where we come into play, is looking at rocks. And while they go back really far, they don't give us annual records, so they're not always the same or perfect, but we can look at them and understand about the ancient climate. But more importantly, we can use these all together and have a more holistic picture of how it works. And so the last couple of slides here, I'm just going to focus is that the different colors here are related to the types of records we have. So the red are coral reefs, and you can see these are all in the equatorial regions. So it tells us something about certain areas of the ocean, not the entire world. The green is tree ring records. We have a lot of those in the northern hemisphere. We have a large lot of land mass there, but they're all in temperate regions because in order to get tree rings that have light and dark wood in them, you have to have seasons, and so you have to have seasonality. Obviously, there's lots of trees in the tropics, but they typically get rainfall all year round, so they don't have quite the tree ring record. And lastly, the ice cores are sort of these high latitude settings, and so they don't tell you the entire setting either. But together they are really powerful because these are all sort of yearly sort of records. And lastly, we can see all the places we've drilled the ocean for ocean sediments, and it's a whole range. And each of these has their pros and cons, but together we can put them all together and really understand what the climate dynamics might be and how to understand them. And so what we're really trying to do is piece together what the world looks like using one puzzle piece at a time. And it's obviously relatively complicated, and we don't always get it right. But we take that piece out and put a new piece in. It's especially difficult when you have lots of blue pieces, right? And so that's what we're trying to put together. And some pieces are more important than others, but through time, we're putting this together. And so the idea here is that we're kind of looking at the modern climate change due to fossil fuels, and we use things in the ancient, much like volcanism, to understand what the processes that climate change might affect. And so what my lab group does is we look at ancient climate and extinction events. We basically take sediments and we dissolve them in a clean lab at the MagLab, and we dissolve those and we look at the chemistry of those sediments using some instrumentation with magnets, so we can look at the abundance and the elemental concentrations to then understand what the oceans look like in terms of oxygen throughout Earth's history. And what we're finding is some really interesting work that during mass extinctions and major climate events that oxygen has changed quite dramatically, which probably was a factor in affecting the life on the planet. And so I just want to highlight two things that I think they're coming up soon in the MagLab open house. And one is the escape room, which Kristen and I were just talking about, which is in a couple of days on Thursday at 7 p.m. And one that's even sooner, which is today, later today, tonight, I believe, which is kitchen chemistry, which is near and dear to my heart, that we have some kitchen chemistry. My kids love doing kitchen chemistry, so hopefully you guys can join and check that out. And so with that, I'll sort of stop there and take questions, and we can have a fun conversation.
I loved that presentation, Dr. Owens, and your work is just so fascinating, right? How you look to the past to make predictions to the future. I mean, it's just completely mind-boggling, right? Like you're kind of like a time traveler. What is your most ancient, like when you're talking about like the ancient past, like how old are we really talking? Like how old are some of these samples? What's your oldest sample?
Yeah, I knew I didn't want to bore everybody with all the details. And so some of those pictures were from mass extinction events in what we consider the Phanerozoic. So since animals have been around the last 600 million years. And so those ranged from pretty much that entire time span with looking at mass extinctions. We have 5 major mass extinctions. Most of us think of the in-dinosaur extinction, which is a big one. We aren't currently working on that in the lab, although we've just recently published. I've been on a publication with some of that, but one that's really close that my graduate student is working on is the Permo-Triassic, which is actually the largest mass extinction, and that's 250 million years. That actually precedes the dinosaurs and probably actually allowed them to proliferate. But my samples go all the way back into what we consider the Archean, early Earth, all the way to about 3 billion years, which is when we start initially seeing changes in oxygen. Really, really small amounts. And so we're interested in why does that happen and how does that occur? And so 3 billion years, I guess, is what we can talk about. But the really exciting things with animals is the last 600 million. And we're working on many different events here at Florida State.
So cool.
And a MagLab, sorry.
Yeah, of course, all the places, right? I mean, science is a team. I think that is just so cool to think about, you know, those 3 billion year old samples. There's actually a question in the chat, like, how do you get a sample that's 3 billion years old? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of those ice cores and you know, tree rings and things like that. But once you start getting real old, like what is that sample like? How do you get it? What does it look like to work with it? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's a challenge. It takes a team, right? So the implications that my group works on, you know, has built on its many other people's work, right? And it's not just that we can pick out a sample and tomorrow start working on it. So it's usually many years before we can get to this point. For instance, we've been working on the Triassic-Jurassic boundary in Alaska, and we've been doing field work for about 4 years, and we're finally getting the first paper to come out. So it takes a significant amount of time. But the 3 billion year old rocks, many of the oldest rocks are in South Africa and Australia. They're really old cratons, old continents basically that have been around. And much of that marine sediment was deposited and it was subducted at some point and then brought up to the surface. So it's been through a history, right? It's long and old, but and so these are rocks that are pretty crystallized through time, but we can age date them in several different ways. And so that's what we have to do in order to understand how old they are. The older the rock, the more difficult it is to pinpoint exact ages. For instance, some of these 3 billion year old rocks have an error measurement about 40 or 50 million years, which is obviously a long time. But when you're thinking about 3 billion years, it's you know, not all that big of a difference. And so that's why I say when we're looking at sediments, we don't get really great, you know, yearly records per se, but we get long-term records. And so, yeah, so these are rocks that people have worked on. They don't have any sort of biology in them. So it's all based on chemistry and being able to radio date them. So use radioactive decay of things like lead or uranium to lead processes. And there's a few others as well, but those are ones that most people know. So yeah, it's things that have been published for a long, or been worked on for a long time.
That was like some mind reading right there, right, Carlos? There was a question about how you aged something that old and how you age dated, which you started to talk about with that radioactive decay. Are there other processes that you want to share with people about how you would age date something that old?
Yeah, so you can't just age date anything, right? I mean, you have to know the mineral type, and so there's specific minerals that we look at. So some are that are more typical are zircons, and so these are really specific minerals. If you're looking at more recent things, we can use carbon even. So there's a radioactive isotope of carbon called C14, and but it decays really quickly. So you can't use that in really old rocks. And so you have to know which elements you're using and roughly what the ages are before you start working on it, because each has a different half-life, so how quickly they decay. And so uranium lead is really long, and so you wouldn't use that for modern sediments. You would use carbon, right? And so each one sort of has its own clock or time scale that you would use. And so and then when you're finding these minerals, it's like some can be a needle in a haystack. You know, you imagine that you're trying to find certain minerals that came from, you know, certain rocks. And so that's part of what we do, or what some geologists do is try to age date those and find the oldest material on Earth. And then you can also, if you know that the rock, right, if you have minerals that are within the rock, you know that the rock has to be younger than that specific mineral, for instance, right? Because it's the minerals within the rock. So the age, and we can start working out sort of like a puzzle, sort of how it layers up on itself. And so one is absolute age dating, which is sort of this radioactive dating, and another is using sort of integrated age dating. So you're using other factors to put it in context or in layers. And so it's a mixture of both of these that we use. And that's what's important, because we try to take one area and relate that to a whole different place. So take the old rocks in Australia and relate that to South Africa. And you may not always get the same minerals to date, but we can put them in stratigraphic order, sort of layers, and then use those age dates to tie them together, for instance.
I love it, like your own little escape room puzzle. But
it is a gigantic puzzle, right? In both space, right, trying to put together the whole Earth, but also then we have time components. So it's a little bit of a 3D puzzle, you know, if you're thinking of it that way.
I love it. Dr. Owens, the time space puzzle master here, right? Bringing all of that together. You know, we're going to play that up. So Dr. Owens, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit. I mean, this is such an interesting area of research, right? How did you find your way here? A paleo-oceanographer, you know, looking to the past to think about the future. Tell us a little bit about your own path. Did you always know you wanted to be a scientist and this kind of scientist? How'd you get here?
A very meandering, winding path. And I see my wife is on here, so she's going to totally call me out. But so she teaches high school chemistry, so it's at least has connection. But you know, yeah, no, I definitely did not think I was going to be here. If you would have asked me probably at almost any step, this is not where I thought I was going to go. But my undergrad degree was environmental science, and I became really interested in modern climate change, as you might think. But I started becoming even more fascinated with how do we know modern climate change is so different than anything we've had in the past. And so that's really, it drives all of my research basically, is sort of how do we understand ancient climate change? What caused it, which admittedly we don't know very well. But then what are the sequence of events that happens once that occurs? What's the time scale like? And what might we learn from that to then tell us about modern? And so that's what's driven me in my research and the interest. And so it sort of has been a very iterative process, I think. So there's been a couple of articles through the MagLab that I've been a part of. That my undergrad, I did not have the world's most stellar career to start with. I had some big hiccups. but I think, in a lot of ways, that was some of the best things that happened to me in my research career, is it motivated me. And what I realized is, you have to really put your time and effort into studying this, anything you do. And so after I had that pretty large hiccup, I really pushed into to understanding my studies for the last couple of years. And because of that, my GPA wasn't great. It was fine. My last 2 years were great. I was on Dean's honor roll list, but because of that big hiccup, it was pretty bad. And so I didn't think I was going to grad school. And it just happened that one of my last semesters, I ended up taking a class from a geology professor who I ended up working with as an undergrad, and then ended up staying to do my master's degree. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to do my master's. I'll move on. And then I stayed to do a PhD, and then one thing led to another. But and so it was never necessarily a defined path, but I just became so intrigued with the science and the research and what we could learn, and how much we still have to learn, that I kind of kept going down this path. And so it's never, well, for some people it is they have a very defined, clear path, but not all of us do. And I think that's an important factor for people to recognize, that you can get into science in all sorts of directions. So
I want to thank you for sharing that, because that is something very true. Not just the meandering path. The more I hear, the more I realize a lot of people had a meandering path to get to where they wanted to. But the struggle with the GPA is something that a lot of people don't talk about. And I remember seeing a post the other day, and I pulled it up because I wanted to read it. This is from Ben, who I'm going to guess works at JPL right now. And he posted, got a 2.4 GPA my first semester in college. Thought maybe I wasn't cut out for engineering. Today I've landed 2 spacecraft on Mars and designing one for the moon. STEM is hard for everyone. Grades ultimately aren't what matters. Curiosity and persistence matters. And that's the big picture that we want to take away from this, is that I had my struggles my first 2 years of college. I never thought I'd be working in a national lab. So you just never know. And let that be a message to everybody listening, that it doesn't matter what you did then. It matters more what you're doing now.
Yeah, and if you inspire, what happened was, the person once I became really interested and was working really hard, he saw the passion, right, and the interest, and that becomes really important. So I think that's a good path, and it is. It's not. I think many people think that everybody has a clean path all the way through, because you see where people are now, right? But that doesn't mean that's where they always were, right, and how they were heading there.
Yeah, such a great point. And I'll put a link to that article that Jeremy's mentioning in the chat. It is on our Facebook event page. Maybe you read it before you came here, but a great story where Jeremy shares a little bit more detail about that hiccup, as he calls it here today. A couple of questions in the chat about some of your collaborators and kind of how all that works, and also just like if you have I don't know, a most interesting project or a favorite project that kind of comes to mind. I know that for scientists, that's probably a little bit like picking a favorite child, but I don't know if there's something that you're particularly proud of to share. And then I'll get to some more questions in the chat after you take that one.
All right. Yeah, all this work is collaborative. I mean, I don't do any age dating. When we're out in Alaska, for instance, it's a team of 6 sort of principal investigators, so 6 professors, and then graduate students. So it's a pretty big team, and it can't be done without everybody. And so everybody has their own sort of specialty and project. Although we understand each other, right? Because we know that. But I'm not a paleontologist, so we have a person out there that can tell us the paleontology. And the reason that's important, because when you're in the field, you don't have any idea what the age dates are. But in the last 600 million years, we have biostratigraphy, so biology. Basically, it's extinction events of different organisms through time. And if you know the key ones, you might be able to tell us roughly what age that sediment is. And so we have a good idea of where we're at geologically, and can work through that. So there's, and then if bring the samples back, we might send them to somebody that does age dating, for instance. And so all of this is highly collaborative. And that's a really good example because we're doing the field work. But even when I'm not doing field work, we might get samples from other people that have already done all this background work in order to do some of the geochemical analysis that I do. And so we don't go collect all of our samples. They would just and do all of the work. We, basically 1 or 2 of these studies would be your entire life's work if you did that. And so it takes a big team and lots of people that have done work for decades even at times. And so yeah, it's all incredibly collaborative. And a lot of times we're not just looking at one place in the world, we're trying to look at multiple places. So it's, one study, one of the papers that just was accepted yesterday for my PhD student for the Permo-Triassic, we looked at 3 or 4 sites, right? And that would be probably 2 PhDs worth of work just in that. So yeah, it's very, very collaborative. And how do we get to that point? It's a lot of it is you're interested in certain questions, and so you might team up with others that are working on those questions, but not maybe with the same expertise as you. So you're trying to look at people that have overlapping interest and experience, but are different enough that they bring something new to the table. Other ways, like for samples and different events, we might be targeting an event, and we know certain people have those samples and have done a lot of work because they published on them already. So we will contact them and collaborate with them to do these additional studies. So it's a broad range, and yeah, depends on the project. So there's so many collaborations across the board. I couldn't narrow it down, but it's all over the world. I mean, we have people from literally all over. I mean, all in Europe, numerous institutions in the US, Australia, China.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm leaving people out.
The scientific scope of these projects, I think, is we talked to like one scientist, and I think that, for us regular people, like, we don't realize all of this takes a huge, massive team, right? There's a great kind of conversation and question in the chat that I wonder if you could comment about too, Dr. Owens. Someone's pointing out that over these timescales, plates are also in motion, right? And that could influence your sample location. So at the MagLab, do we also investigate those magnet patterns on the ocean floor?
Oh, that's a good question. It's funny you asked. We are in the middle of a faculty search, and there was one person of that faculty search that does these sorts of things. But we currently know we don't have anybody doing that. But the funniest part about this, or I guess the most interesting part about this question, is that so there'd be a paleomagnetist would be what they do, and you're looking at the magnetism in the rock to tell where the North Pole is, and so you can see how the plates might move around in relation to the magnetic North Pole. And the worst place that they could probably bring their samples to is the MagLab. Because if you brought it in there and the strong magnets might change the entire direction of the minerals.
It'll demagnetize them. That makes perfect sense.
Demagnetize them. Yep. So they would like
the samples.
But they would use magnets in their own aspects, but they probably would not want to be for that exact analysis. They wouldn't want to be at the MagLab. There's other aspects that they would, and there's some reasons that they could use some of the instrumentation, but it's sort of contradictory to what you might think, right?
Yeah, and now we've also learned that the concept of paleomagnetists, which is, I wrote down because that's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's a whole field of itself and very difficult. But yeah, it's interesting because it's looking at how those plates move around. Where when you see the ancient reconstructions throughout Earth's history, that's basically what they're doing, is they're taking the magnetic field and how the rock is set at that time. So you have to look at specific rocks. Again, you can't look at like any rocks, because you have to have it, the magnetic North Pole is set when the rock goes from a magma and cools and I guess it goes from a lava to a rock. That's probably a better way to say it. And so that when it cools at that specific point, then it locks in the magnetic North Pole.
So cool. There's a question in the chat too about whether you have any dream samples. animals, like something you'd really like to analyze that you haven't gotten your hands on yet, maybe?
Yeah, well, I think in the field in general, we would like to have our oldest sediments we can really analyze is about 3 billion years old. And so, having something that could go older than that, but it doesn't exist currently to really do the work I do, to understand if maybe we think it was the ocean or the atmosphere was anoxic, so no oxygen. But there might be some time periods where there's increases or changes. And there's throughout what we consider before the animals, so the last 600 million years, between 4.6 and 0.6, so that 4 billion years, we broadly understand how oxygen has changed, but we don't have, we have lots of gaps in the record, in the geologic record. And I think there's many aspects and time periods we would like to look at, especially when some more multicellular organisms start coming up. And the other part of that question is that while we might have extinction events recorded, like the Permo-Triassic, but we only get a couple of places, like 3, we would really like to see better coverage than that. But the problem is plate tectonics. And what happens when plate tectonics happens, the material, the ocean material mainly, subducts down underneath and is destroyed when it goes into the mantle, because it's all goes into the mantle and is heated up and destroyed. So we don't get a complete record, and I think that's what we would really like to see is more of a complete record. But we're working with geologic samples and process. So again, what we're doing is we're putting together the pieces of the puzzle. And I didn't make this analogy, but one of my favorite things to say is we're trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle, but you have a 4-year-old that lost 60% of the puzzle, right? And so you're left with, and you don't have the picture to start with. And so you're left trying to piece it together and see what you have. And while that seems like, why are we doing this? We do actually get a relatively, decent record. And what I would say, if you're thinking about the world, is that not all the pieces are created equal. And so you might get the outlines of a continent, and you might not have all the ocean, or you maybe some of the ocean, but maybe it's not all the important pieces, right? And so that's an important aspect, is we're looking for the big picture parts. But what I would say is if we had our dream samples, we would have a lot more of that.
I love that analogy, the puzzle where you've lost so many of the pieces and you don't even know what you're making to start with, right? It's I think that's a great way for people to kind of picture what science in general is like, but particularly your field of study.
It is, and that's, it's important for everybody to understand how iterative the process is. And sometimes people, well, you can hear like, oh, well, in the past, in 1980, we thought it was X, and it's really Y. And it's like, well, that's how science works, is that the best data suggested that we had a way of understanding the data in a certain way. But then as we gained more data, it might have pushed us to a different set of understandings. And so, and that's really what my field is doing, is we're constantly refining sort of our understanding. And sometimes it gets complicated and we don't fully get it, right? And it just takes more data and better understandings. But
love that. If you're listening to this conversation and are thinking of new questions that you have for Dr. Owens about his research, or him as a person, what it's like to be a scientist, put them in the chat. We'll just keep chatting ourselves here, but these have been some great questions so far. So if you have more questions to add, go ahead and add them into the chat.
So you used one of the key words. You said listen, so I'm going to jump off of that and say, Jeremy, it's Thursday, middle of the afternoon. You're working on data, and you've reached this little lull. You need a little inspiration. What do you listen to in the lab?
So I have one genre, which probably makes me very simple. But rock music is the way for me to go. It lifts you up, at least for me. Rock out on it. And it's a range within rock music, but I certainly and have a whole bunch of different artists. But that's the direction to go for me.
I was going to ask if there's anyone in particular.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I have some standbys, you know, that we certainly listen to. I've listened a lot to Shinedown recently, and some newer bands too that are in that genre. But yeah, I think Stone Sour, those kind of bands, which are probably not typical music for academics, but that's what I enjoy. So it's, and you can hear that, that's in my office too. I just have to be careful not to play it too loud. So and sometimes, yeah, it's put the headphones on, right, if you really need to do it. But yeah, and it's I have some certain songs that actually, it's funny, that helps me write, because it's something, it's almost like Pavlovian. I think it's I've sort of listened to it a lot when I was writing previously, and I kind of put my headphones on, and it is sort of triggers a mind of like, you're supposed to be writing, get going. So
I love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, you wanna tell us one of those songs that like you just turn on if you have to write? What is one of those go-to songs for writing about science?
Well, I had one when I was doing my PhD, and so that still comes up, and it's, the song name is "If You Can Get Through This, You Can Get Through Anything." And so that's it was, yeah. I think it's always a good motivation.
Yeah, that sums it right up, huh? That definitely sums it right up. Are you, Dr. Owens, a member of any like fandoms? You know, do you know which Hogwarts house you would be sorted into, or you know, you'd rather live on Tatooine during a certain time period? I don't know. Marvel.
All the talk about the past and history, I'm praying that we go Doctor Who routes.
Doctor Who, yeah. Any fandoms that you're a part of?
I'm really boring on this front. Yeah, I mean, I do actually know, I think the Hogwarts, or at least at some point I did, because grad students kind of force that. But no, I think, well, my go-to away from science, like, is I don't actually watch very much TV. I listen to a lot of music, but I like to make things, so I do a lot of gardening. I've gotten really into woodworking since the pandemic, so I've been doing a lot there as well. So
What kinds of stuff are you making with wood? Small things, big things, artsy things, functional things? Tell us more. Oh, show and tell.
Show and tell.
Oh, I love it.
so I made these.
Beautiful.
And they're very sciencey, right? I mean, they look like organic chemistry, so, which is very.
That's exactly what I thought first. So,
but that's a good shelf too. So yeah, it's I've done a lot of art things, which has been fun for the house, and some more functional things. We're currently starting to work on a dining room table, so, which is probably more than I should be doing, but who knows. And yeah, so it's kind of a range of different projects. Made a tortilla press recently, which was fun. Got to combine food and woodworking somehow.
How cool is that? I love that. I love that.
Yeah, so those are sort of go-tos, and I do a lot of gardening, so I have also show and tell. So
nice.
lots of succulents, which is challenging in Florida.
That is challenging. Is that your favorite thing to grow? Do you have like a favorite plant that you love? One of our other scientists talked about her plant babies. Do you have some plant babies in your life?
Probably not that I would consider plant babies, but I do have a significant amount of plants, and lots of different types of aloes, right? Which are, until people see them, they go, wait, I thought there was just one aloe, just aloe vera, right? But it turns out there's a lot. Yeah, so I do a lot on that, but no, nothing that's like real close. And then gardening, regular vegetable and herb gardening. But
so I have a question for you, right? Like your role is kind of interesting because you're looking to the past to predict the future, or the present and the future. But what do you think people will be looking at today to make guesses about the future, right? Like when now becomes the ancient past, what things will people be, I don't know, looking at to predict the future from then?
Yeah, we, as geologists, I think you think about if you were an alien, you came back to Earth in 100 million years, like what would it look like? Like, how would you know humans were here? I mean, the thing is, humans haven't been around on Earth that long, the species. And so, it seems like a long time because of our own perspective of time, right? Obviously, a million years is a significant amount of time. But when you think of something like the dinosaurs, and they were um, prolific for about 200 million years, but on a planet for even longer than that. It's pretty daunting, right? And so, but the thing is we have altered the landscape so much that what would they see? And so one of the things that we always joked about is, well, you'll probably find a plastic layer, and there's actually rocks now that are classified as plastic rocks. And before that, you'll probably find cigarette butts, right? Because they basically don't degrade, and they'll and you can find them you can actually core the sediment seafloor right now and get layers of cigarette butts. So, but then you'll probably, if you do geochemistry, we as a geochemist, we always laugh of like, what will be the signature? And it's like all of it. It's just going to be crazy. It's going to be so weird that it's going to look nothing like anything in the geologic record. So, it'll be fascinating to know and to think about from a sediment standpoint, right? Like if you think of what I just showed you and talked about in age dating, will we even be able to, in the geologic record, be able to see this signature? Because it might, like the record might be so fast in climate change in a geologic sense that it might be like you're having to pinpoint a really fine layer of sediment to like nail it. And so would you miss it? I mean, it's interesting questions from our standpoint, because we always question of like, how high resolution should we be measuring?
Mhm.
It's obviously a time issue because it takes a lot of time to do it at that level. But are we missing something, right? And the same would be for this. Like if you're not looking for the Anthropocene, is sometimes what it's referred to, are you going to be able to recognize it in the geologic record? Because it's only maybe a few hundred, maybe 1,000 years old or long duration. So
that was such a deep answer to kind of a quirky question. I was not expecting that. The whole aspect of it's going to be so thin, we might just overlook it completely. I mean, you're right. Humans have been a blip on the planet's history. So we got a question in the chat box I wanted to ask. It says, with the Mars mission, they look at the planet Mars and its geology or past climates. Would there be something for us to learn for climate on Earth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of why NASA's interested in this. Some of my deep time, so the stuff that's older, the 3 billion years old sort of record, is funded by NASA, and the reason is we're interested in learning how climate and life evolve on a planet. So co-evolve, I should say, and what we might learn from our planet to then look at other planets, so exoplanets. But part of also going to Mars, right? I mean, it's collecting, the current rover is collecting samples for a return mission, so that we'll actually get samples back. Don't be in a hurry for that though, right? It's like something like 2031 or 32, I believe, before that the mission takes off. So, and then it's got to go there and come back. So, but I mean, part of our interest, right, in studying something like Mars is to understand how life may have existed and why it has ceased. And so I think there's a lot to learn from that planet in terms of life on other planets as a broad scope. For Earth, I mean, certainly I think there's probably aspects that we'll be able to understand better, such as how plate tectonics plays a role in recycling elements. So one of the reasons that Mars might not have life now, but it might have in the past might have had life, is because without plate tectonics, you don't get the natural recycling of elements, right? Where it's taking material at the surface and subducting it and melting it, and then bringing that back up as new material for organisms to use. And so that natural recycling mechanism is likely very important for life, because without it, you don't have new elements for these organisms to use. So there's certainly a large aspect of understanding climate on a planet without tectonics, and then maybe, what had happened previously.
Awesome.
You looked at Europa, because you mentioned life. You talked about the cycling and the tectonics. And when I was an undergraduate, I did a little bit of research on Europa. And Europa is one of Jupiter's moons, the ice world. We think that there is a cycle underneath that layer of ice. We think that there might be some individual ice tectonics going on there. There's a lot of interesting things on Europa. Have you delved into that at all?
I have not personally. I mean, I know I know a little bit about it. How about that? And I mean, there's been spacecrafts that have gone by and looked at the organics that are coming out of some of that material that's being sprayed out, and looking for signs of life on those organic molecules. And certainly that's one of the reasons we're so interested in it, because it is tectonically active, obviously a very different substrate, because it's ice rather than continents, but it's still important because of this natural recycling. And so there's a whole field of people that do this in terms of I think there's habitable planets, which is a NASA initiative, and they look at icy worlds as a place for life. And as we continue to understand more and more about habitable planets, worlds, the habitable zone that was really narrowly defined early on has continued to expand in ways that we didn't understand before. So the problem for us, obviously for me, right, is we don't have samples. So like, how are we supposed to do this? So a lot of my work is really tied to where we can get samples from, and then what can we extrapolate out to other planets that we can learn. But a lot of this, with the launch of James Webb Space Telescope, we have better resolution to look at more exoplanets. One of the main things that they're going to look at is actually looking for tectonically active planets. And so what we can learn here about tectonics and life and how those sort of work together might give us insights in how to look for life on other planets.
Yeah, Dr. Owens, just a kind of off the wall, maybe uncomfortable question. Do you believe there's life to be found on other planets?
Yeah, I don't think we're that special. So I mean, chemistry, there's a whole bunch of reasons that I think, I mean, if chemistry and physics are sort of basic science and building blocks, they shouldn't react any differently on another place, as far as we understand. And so, and when I say life on other planets, it doesn't necessarily mean like we're going to be able to talk to some organism, right? But like microbial life has probably been on this planet for at least 2.5 billion years by our records, and probably earlier than that. That's somewhat debated. So that's a really long time, and that's likely the case on other planetary bodies. Now, if it survives and lasts a really long time, it's another case, and how evolution works and how the planet works is all relatively complicated. But from a microbial standpoint, it's pretty hard for me to not think that there's life somewhere else. But why it evolved like it has on this planet is, I think, a really fascinating question, right?
Yeah. That I mean, all of that is just like so mind-boggling and mind-blowing. There's a couple of simple questions I like to ask just to kind of get an insight into how scientists' mind work. So I wonder if you could tell me, do you think that cereal is technically a soup?
That is not a fair question.
You're not the first victim, so yes, you've got to answer.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you have sort of a substrate, a liquid, and you've got things in it.
I'll buy it. I'll buy it. And similarly, is a hot dog a sandwich?
The hot dog's not really even food.
Clearly, this is not sponsored by any hot dog manufacturer. So that's a definitive answer from.
But I think the classification of a sandwich, I think it does have to be included in there.
Okay, I like it. I like how our scientists who answer these questions are very certain, right? Certain about their answers. And I think that it's fun for us to just get a glimpse into how, different scientists' minds work and approach these questions. This has been such, oh, go ahead.
But if you ask me after thinking about this, my mind I might have a different opinion after I give it some more thought.
Yeah. And I think to wrap up our session, this question is just too good not to cover. Studying the field that you do, what kinds of things do you do in your daily life that impact climate change, right? Like, how do you personally slow down climate change as a human?
Yeah, this is always a question I think we struggle with in so many ways. Because obviously to do my work, we have to travel, and which is not a great footprint necessarily, but it's sort of a moral dilemma at some levels. My personal feeling is this is a lot larger than one person. This is a community issue, and so it needs to be sort of big picture, ways to solve this. And so a lot of what I envision or think about is what our leadership is doing from a state and federal standpoint. Of course, anything we can do to reduce your own carbon footprint is great. We certainly make some choices, as many as you can, doing that, but it's not perfect. Because of some of the things that I do, I have a truck, for instance, which I don't love driving around consistently, but at the same time, I'm not going to have 3 vehicles because the carbon footprint on that is even bigger, right? Because you're actually producing all that steel and things. So try not to drive it a ton, right? And things like that. But and I think the one big part, especially here in Florida, that I think about is preserving some of the most vulnerable and important places. So things that are like wetlands are some of the biggest impacts we can have, besides obviously burning fossil fuels, because wetlands are really productive of taking up CO2 and actually not just making organic matter, but actually burying it and taking it out of the system. And so preserving those places, which are usually around coastlines and get gobbled up by big developments, are really important for us to continue to preserve. And so I think those are some of the best ways to do it. Of course, obviously there's lots of discussion on changes in food and habits and things like that. And my family, we do a little bit of that within reason. And I think that's what you hope to do. But I think the big changes are really from our elected leaders that we can really push to have better policy.
Great reminder that there's a lot of work for all of us to do when it comes to combating the future of climate change, and we'll look forward to learning more about the past from researchers like Dr. Owens and his collaborators who are helping give us a more complete picture of Earth's complicated climate history and what it might mean for our future. I appreciate everyone who joined us today to have this kind of open conversation with Dr. Owens, and I appreciate Dr. Owens taking our fun and quirky questions. And I encourage all of you to join us tonight for some kitchen chemistry. We're going to be cooking up some fun at 6:30. So find the link to that Zoom link, and we'll see you tonight and or at a future open house session. And don't forget to stick around for the survey in just a second as we wrap up this session. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. That was great.